Moshe understanding something very profound. For Jews, it's easier to build their country. It's harder to keep it going. I'm saying that while I'm right now on the verge of, I don't want to say a panic attack, but I'm filled with anxiety as an Israeli in 2023, understanding that the job of building Israel was hard, but sustaining it, keeping it going might even be harder. That is what Moshe understood. He doesn't give him one piece of advice how to conquer Israel. All his advice, all his instructions, how after you're successful, how does that success not destroy you? How do you stay in Israel?
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. 2 months ago, on September 8th, I recorded an interview with Micah Goodman about Sefer Devarim, the Book of Deuteronomy. He wrote a book about Devarim, which was recently translated into English, entitled The Last Words of Moses, and published by Magid Books. The interview was really fascinating, both because of the theological insights that Micah provided, and also because of the way that he was able to relate Moshe's words to current events in the state of Israel. At the time, I planned to release this episode as the first episode of our new season, which began after Sukkot. Of course, everything changed with the terrible Hamas massacre of October 7th, and a podcast dedicated to Sefer Devarim that also talked about some of the issues facing Israel before October 7th seemed hopelessly anachronistic. But I decided to listen to the interview again, and as I heard what Micah Goodman said, I realized that his words are actually now more relevant than ever. He sees Moshe's words in Sefer Devarim as the primary guide for what Israel needs to do in order for us to stay in our land and to create the kind of society that God wants us to create. For the first time in 50 years, many of us have realized that our hold on the land of Israel is not unconditional and it's not free. And just as we need to protect Israel militarily from those who would destroy her, we also need to think about what Israel needs to become in order to be worthy of the sacrifices that so many have made on her behalf. I think that the shock of what happened over the past 37 days will likely lead to a realignment of life in Israel on many levels, political, social, and religious. Things will never be the same, and our role has to be to use the moments that are going to arrive in order to create a state of Israel that refuses to fall into tired old patterns, but instead represents what we want a true Jewish society to be. With that in mind, please listen to this conversation and consider not only what we want Israel to become, but what Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher Moses, said that Israel has to become. We'll get to that discussion in a moment. First, I want to ask you to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review and share it with people who'll enjoy it as well. I have a Substack called Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, to which you can subscribe for free. The link is in the description of this podcast. Over the past week, I released 2 new articles. The first, entitled Our Son and the IDF, addresses my emotions when our son Yaakov received notice that he will be called up to the Israeli army this December. And the second, entitled A Mark on My Forehead, A Mark on Yours, is a way of dealing with the non-stop gaslighting that so many Jews have been experiencing over the past weeks. Please check them out, and please again subscribe today. And finally, remember that JCH Podcast Productions is the best place for you to go in order to produce your podcast from start to finish. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com so that we can discuss helping you make a high-quality, professional, and popular podcast. Micah Goodman was named by the Jerusalem Post as one of the 50 most influential Jews in 2017, and by the Israeli magazine Liberal as one of the 100 most influential Israelis in 2019. He is the author of 6 best-selling books. His first 3, The Last Words of Moses, The Dream of the Kuzari, and The Secrets of the Guide for the Perplexed, explore classical Jewish thought. His next 3, The Wandering Jew, Catch 67, and The Attention Revolution, explore contemporary Israeli issues and ideas. Dr. Micah Goodman, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
I'm glad to be here.
You wrote a book which was recently translated into English as The Last Words of Moses. It's a wide-ranging interpretation of Sefer Devarim, and it starts from the perspective that these are the words of Moshe Rabbeinu rather than the words of God himself. I think some people find that surprising. I don't. We can discuss that as well. you argue because of that this is his unique interpretation of everything that had transpired over the previous 40 years and his anticipation of what has to happen when they go into the land of Israel. I just finished reading it, and it was absolutely enlightening and fantastic. I really enjoyed it very much and learned a lot from it. So to start off, let me ask you why you wrote this book and what were you trying to accomplish in this book?
This book is coming out now in English, but it came out in 2014 in Hebrew. And it's still relevant because the Tanakh is always relevant and the Torah is still relevant and Moshe is always relevant. But the only thing that's less relevant is me, myself. I have a hard time tapping into who I was when I was writing this book in 2012 and 2013. And also, I'm highly influenced by the way the book was received in Israel by Israelis. And I could now, reverse engineer and try to tell myself a story that the purpose of the book is what it did to Israelis. But I think they had a different, but I'll tell you what it did to Israelis.
I want to hear that too, yes.
Okay. So I think Israelis understood this book as a book about power. It's a book about how do we build a healthy relationship between us and the power that we have and that we own. And on an individual level and on a collective level. And here's how many Israelis understood or told me that this is what the book has done for them. I think I had in my mind, I probably had a different agenda. Maybe I'll share that with you in a minute. But like the way Israelis understood it was the following. You know how all these self-help books, I have a theory that there's always a common denominator where people tell their stories, their life stories, that there's always a crisis there. Now they went through the crisis and got strong thanks to the crisis. And it's always about how do you deal with failure? How do you deal with a crisis? And I think the Book of Deuteronomy is asking the opposite question. Not how do you deal with failure, but how do you deal with success?
Interesting.
With the moral, ethical, theological dangers of success. And that is true as individuals, where we could be the moral victims of our own success. But more importantly, it's also true as a collective. What happens when as a collective we become very strong, as a collective very powerful, as a collective very successful? Now, there were in the ancient world, even Jews, like, for example, Jesus, or the way he's commonly interpreted, that success, abundance, power is so dangerous spiritually, let's avoid it. I would say a contemporary parallel to that is people like Franz Rosenzweig, Hermann Koch, 20th century important thinkers, important philosophers that said that power corrupts, and if Jews have power, Jews will be corrupted by their own power. And that's why they were against Zionism. Now, Moshe shares the sensibility. Power is dangerous, but he doesn't share the conclusion, therefore we avoid power. We need power. We need power for two reasons. We need to be strong in order to survive in a hostile world, and we need power because without power, we can't change and heal the world. But here's the question, here's the paradox that I think is in the heart of the book of Sefer Devarim. We need power in order to change the world, but when you have power, it's your internal world that changes. We need power in order to heal the world. You can't heal the world without power. Once you have power, the negative impact of power could change your world and destroy your own world. So how do they have power so you could change the world without your world being changed and distorted? That is the challenge that the book of Sefer Devarim, the Deuteronomy, the last words of Moses, are trying to deal with that question. So I'm sharing it, and he writes this book. I mean, Moshe understands when he delivers this speech that three important things are going to happen to the Jewish people right after he finishes his speech and dies. Three important things. One, they're separating themselves from their leader. That itself could shake a society where their admired leader is God. Two, they enter Eretz Israel. And three, they become powerful. It's a political change. It's a territorial change. But it's also, they stop, once they enter Eretz Israel, conquer Eretz Israel, build a monarchy, it's a radical shift in their own story. They transform themselves from being powerless to becoming powerful. That piece, the transformation between being powerless to being powerful. And how do you deal with that transformation? That is an important piece of Moses' last words. It's an important piece of my book about Moses' last words. And very interesting, that's the piece of my book that was echoed most when the book came out in Israel in 2014.
And of course, that makes sense given that Israel is where this actually applies in a practical level today, which you discuss as well. But Micah, if you can tell me, you said that wasn't necessarily your original agenda in writing the book.
Yes, it's a piece of the book. It's a few chapters in the book. I wrote the book, I think I started I'll tell you the truth. I don't think I ever shared this before. I didn't want to write a book about Sefer Devarim. I wanted to write a book about Nevi'im Rishonim. Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Bet, Melachim Aleph, Melachim Bet. And I think there's a grand narrative between Yoshua and Melachim. And because Sefer Devarim is a good introduction to Nevi'im Rishonim, I thought, hey, I'll study Sefer Devarim. And then from there, I'll move. But then the introduction to Nevi'im Rishonim, the introduction to the book became the book. Because I discovered Sefer Devarim while I was working on Nevi'im Rishonim. I discovered Sefer Devarim because I thought if Sefer Devarim is an introduction to Yoshua Shoftim, to the next 4 books. By the way, it's 4 books because Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet used to be 1 book, and Melachim Aleph and Melachim Bet used to be 1 book. And then I noticed, so interesting, that Sefer Devarim is a summary of the first 4 books, and it's an introduction to the next 4 books.
Interesting.
It's right in the middle. It's right in the middle. And I realized Sefer Devarim is a centerpiece of the entire grand biblical narrative. So I started thinking about Sefer Devarim as a window that if we look clearly in through this window, we could see the deepest secrets of the Tanakh itself. So I started realizing that Sefer Devarim is an introduction to biblical philosophy. I thought I don't want to write a book about biblical philosophy. That's too big. But the closest I could get, I think the book that itself is Introduction to Biblical Philosophy is Sefer Devarim. So because I'm interested in philosophy, and my first 2 books were the philosophy of Maimonides and the philosophy of the Kuzari, I wanted to write a book about the philosophy of the Bible. That's too pretentious, the philosophy of the Bible. But the closest I could get is to write about the hidden ideas in Sefer Devarim, which I do think capture some of the deep essence and ideas of the Bible itself.
And of course, in the book itself, you do have a little bit of the introduction to the future as you compare and contrast Yehoshua and Shlomo HaMelech and how they implemented the ideals of Devarim. So that is clearly there manifest in the book on some level.
The piece with, in the end, the Rishonim are a chapter. If they're not the book, they're a chapter in a different book.
Right.
Yes.
But I find it interesting that you say that this is in some ways the centerpiece, the keystone of biblical philosophy, only because of your understanding that these are the words of Moshe Rabbeinu, as opposed to the words of Hashem, which is what the first 4 books of the Torah are. And what I mean by that is this. I don't find that to be theologically problematic, even though you have a conclusion, you have an afterword where you discuss these issues, because frankly, if we look throughout the Torah, there are people who are quoted all the time. Paro's quoted, Abraham's quoted, Yitzchak's quoted, Yaakov's quoted, Avimelech's quoted, etc. This is just a long quote. He said it, and it was a long quote that was included, so I don't see the theological problem, even though I understand some people might. Nevertheless, you also suggest that Moshe is in some ways reframing what had been learned in the first books, or specifically the previous 3 books, the legal books of the Torah, and expressing it in somewhat different terms and perhaps emphasizing different ideas. For example, you discuss the de-emphasis of the Beit HaMikdash, or more specifically, the de-emphasis on sacrifices and a re-emphasis on one specific place, but removing God from that. We'll get to all that in a moment. What I mean to ask is this. Given that you see this specifically as Moshe's almost interpretation of the things that had been said previously, how can this represent sort of the centerpiece of biblical philosophy as opposed to, so to speak, an interpretation of biblical philosophy?
You know what? Maybe maybe this is an interpretation of biblical philosophy. Maybe I'll buy the way you're framing it. Because Moshe tells the entire story all over again, and as we all know from life, when you hear a story and you tell it again, when you're telling it again, you're interpreting it. First of all, because you're choosing which parts to tell again and which not to tell again. Some of the parts to tell again, you'll say them in your own words. Every time you are repeating a story or you're telling a story again in your words, you're interpreting it. And that is exactly what Moshe is doing. He's telling Sifur Yetziat Mitzrayim all over again, but differently. I know you want to go into sacrifice in minutes. I won't go there now. I'll go to a different element. When Moshe tells the story all over again, the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is told without Moshe. You see, Moshe has two roles in the Torah. In Sefer Shemot, he is the hero of a story. In Sefer Devarim, he is the teller of a story. By the way, Rabbi, is that English, the teller of a story?
It works for me.
Like a storyteller?
I think it's good. It works.
Okay.
We'll go with it.
In the Shemot, he is the hero of a story. He went to Pharaoh, he went to the people, and he led us out of Egypt. That's Shemot. In Sefer Devarim, he's the teller of the story. Now, we know from history that people like to have both roles. To be a hero of a historic event, and then to be the historian of that event. Like Josephus Papius. He is one of the most important players in the Great Revolt of the Jews against the Romans. And then he becomes the historian of that revolt, like David Ben-Gurion.
I believe it was Winston Churchill who said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it."
Exactly. Churchill's a great example. He is the hero of World War II, and he tried to be the storyteller of World War II in that gigantic 4 books about World War II he wrote. But usually, what's the motivation of people like Josephus, of Churchill, of Ben-Gurion, when they want both roles? I think we know what, like you said, like Churchill said, I think when they are the heroes of the story, they're trying to shape the future. When they are tellers of the story, they're trying to shape the past. And almost always their agenda is because they want to just make sure that we all remember their role in the story of the past. Moshe has both roles. In Shemot, he creates the future, and in Devarim, he's creating the narrative, the image of the past. But paradoxically, what he does when he tells the story all over again, he tells a story of Exodus without Moshe. Like Moshe was never a part of the story. He didn't deal with the politics of Pharaoh. He didn't deal with the Exodus from Egypt. He didn't deal with the threatening challenges of the Midbar. I know a lot of readers already noticed that in the Haggadah and Pesach, Moshe is barely mentioned. We like to say how amazing it is that we tell the story without the hero of it. We're taking the hero of the story out of the story. But the truth is that the first person to Sefer Yetziat Mitzrayim without Moshe was Moshe.
And by the way, let me mention that we don't usually notice this only because we seldom look at Sefer Devarim in isolation. We always read it as part of a continuum with that which came before. So what you're doing is very important. You're noticing things that many of us will just pass by because we see the same story and just interpolate that which was said earlier into that story without noticing its unique characteristics.
I think it's very interesting as Talmidim of Torah, students of Torah. What we do a lot of times, we read other layers of text into the text. For example, my challenge for my girls is always them to read the Torah without, it doesn't say in Nefesh that Abraham broke the idols of his father. That's Chazal. And subconsciously, we read Chazal into the Torah. But for the Torah to speak clearly, we have to read the Torah without Chazal. But Rabbi, what we're discussing now is even more challenging not only to read the Torah without Chazal, to read the Torah without parts of the Torah. To read Sefer Devarim without Sefer Shemot, without Sefer Bamidbar. To read Sefer Devarim as it is, stripped from other books. And to listen to Sefer Devarim as Moshe is asking me to listen to Sefer Devarim. He's asking me to imagine that one of the Hebrews sitting on the other side of the Jordan Valley, of the Jordan River, on the eastern side, listening to his last words. What were they listening to? And they heard a story told all over again. And Moshe was telling the story, but the story was without Moshe.
That's an amazing insight. And what do you think that teaches us about his understanding of his own leadership? What was he trying to convey through that?
Well, I have a theory. I think I'm trying to prove this theory in the book, but I'll just share the theory without, going into text now. Moshe remembers what happened last time that he disappeared, and they thought he's dead. Ze Moshe ha'ish, asher ha'elanu me'eret Yitzrayim. Lo yadanu ma hayad. They don't know about what happened to him. So what did they do? They worshipped Egel HaZahav. The worship of Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, the worshiping of the golden calf was a reaction to the absence of Moshe. By the way, I think it's fair to say that the sin, when they said to the golden calf, to Egel HaZahav, Ere Elohecha Israel, Asher Elucha Eretz Yisrael. I don't know how to translate this. When they say the golden calf, you, the golden calf.
You are the God who took you out of Egypt.
Yes. I think the sin begins when they said, Zen Moshe Aish, Asher Elanu Eretz Yisrael Lo Yadanu. Like the sin begins when they said that Moshe took them out of Egypt. So Nachmanides said that the golden calf wasn't a replacement for God, it was a replacement for Moshe, which they idealized in because they were so influenced by Egyptian political theology where you worship political leaders. That's Egypt. So the interesting thing is, so Nachmanides has a great line that Ramban says, what is Chet Eged? I'm trying to quote, that they tried to create for themselves, Moshe Acher.
A new Moshe.
The Eged is a new Moshe, an Eged. Okay, so now let's go back now 40 years later. If me and you, Rabbi, remember what happened last time Moshe disappeared, they violated the covenant and they turned their backs on God. And that's only when they thought he's dead. What will they do when he's really dead? So Moshe is obvious to them that the crisis that they're going to go through after he dies will only amplify the sin of Chet Eged. And there is Remazim there, Salvomina there, the same language appears again in both places. So I think this is what he does. He tells them, you will thrive without me. You don't need me. You, the people of Israel, are not dependent on me. And you know how I know that you don't need me, you're not dependent on me? Because you never were dependent on me. You never needed me. You did the whole thing without me. So by taking himself out of the past, he is enabling them to survive without him in the future. As opposed to political leaders in our days that try to create the illusion, I don't want to become too actual, to create the illusion that we can survive without them. Moshe does the opposite. He's creating the narrative that you've always thrived without me, and therefore you could still, from now on, do it without me. He's trying to minimize the damage of his disappearance.
Wow, that's a beautiful idea. That's so important. And by the way, I'll point out one more thing, just in reference to what we said earlier about this being the words of Moshe and the perhaps radical nature of this. I just want to say that Rav Soloveitchik himself once said that Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law, begins in Sefer Devarim, which means that it already is that process of Moshe interpreting what happened.
Exactly. So which is me. This is Rav Soloveitchik. This is Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen Milublin. This is Rabbeinu Chaim Ben Attar. I think it's Abaye in the Talmud himself says, Mishneh Torah, Moshe mipi atzmo amaran. This is a very firm position, by the way. But I want to say, the fact that Moshe writes his word, and then writes in his words, but then it was canonized into the Torah, this itself has theological meaning. This means that the voice of humanity is canonized into the book, which is presented as the words of God, which means the Book of Devarim upgrades the human voice. It says the Torah is two things. It's what God says, and it's the way human beings understand what God says. The Torah has two voices, and the Rabbi Tzadok says it's the beginning of the Torah Shabbat, which means, by the way, if according to my interpretation, and not my interpretation, in fact, it's Torah Shabbat, it means that the first Pirush La Torah, the first interpretation for the Torah, is the last book of the Torah. Which means that the first Pirush Torah, the first interpretation of Torah, was delivered by Noten Torah, by Moshe Rabbeinu.
That's an amazing concept. Let's get into that idea of sacrifices now. We talked about that because here is an idea which is really interesting. It's something, once again, which if you look at Devarim, not in isolation, you probably won't notice, but after reading your book, I don't see how I can't not notice it, that whereas in Vayikra and in Bamidbar, there is a strong emphasis on korbanot, and you point out that in Devarim, that emphasis is not there. It's de-emphasized, if anything, while at the same time, there's a strong emphasis on one place of worship. Could you talk about what those mean, why they're important, and how they work together?
Okay, so when we say that the fifth book of the Torah is the first interpretation of the Torah, and we mention it's because also when he tells a story again, there's parts that he leaves out, like himself. Okay, that's what we did before. That's a political, psychological move. But then there's something very important. The Torah has, I would say, the Torah is a mix between two genres, between narrative, nomos and narrative, between laws and between stories, right? By the way, and tell the Torah in the Mizrach HaKaduri, the
Ancient Near East.
Ancient Near East. So we had these two genres. There was like myths like Gilgamesh and there's laws like Hammurabi, but they're separate genres. The Torah is the first text to merge them together, and that'll be the trademark of Judaism ever since. Halacha v'agadah. We live, what is our life? It's about we live in stories and we practice deeds. Halacha v'agadah. So if we go back into these two genres, so a major part of the biblical halacha is building the Mishkan and rituals and zivach, orlah, haktarat haktoret, hatavat hanerot. Like these are all the names of a lot detailed rituals that we're supposed to practice. And then Moshe tells the story of the halacha all over again, and he leaves out almost all the rituals.
Specifically the Beit HaMikdash, meaning the temple rituals.
There is no chatat. You can't find korban chatat in Sefer Devarim. There is no asham in Sefer Devarim. Olah is mentioned in one word, but it's not really taken care. There is like ktoret, hatavat hanerot, hilchot kohanim, hilchot. It's not there. It's the missing part of the speech. So he tells the story all over again, but he leaves out that part of the story of the law. But it gets worse, or maybe better. Depends how you touch this. He doesn't tell the law all over again and then leaves out the ritualistic parts. Besides Korban Shlamim, we'll go into there in a minute. He also tells the narrative all over again. Now the narrative we all know. There was Yetziat Mitzrayim, there was the Midbar. But a key part of the narrative is the building of the Mishkan, right? Betzalel, Ben Uri built the Mishkan, and they're all asked to give their jewelry, and they give too much, right? We love those stories. And there's
a huge percentage of Sefer Shmot is that.
So Shmot and Bamidbar and Va'ikra, and I would say there's more detail in the different process of Bniyat Mishkan than Yetziat Mitzrayim. In the narrative, not only in the law, in the narrative. Nadav ve'Avihu, the great tragedy that happened later on in Sefer Bamidbar, how the Mishkan is located in the center, and everything is in between, and Chanukat HaNesi'im. So, tell Sefer Devarim, the Torah invests more than one book in prime real estate, the Torah itself, the story of building the Mishkan. All of that does not exist when Moshe tells the story again. We have Yetziat Mitzrayim, we have the Midbar, and a book and a half is shrunk into 3 psukim. It goes like this. God tells Moshe, after he breaks the tablets, he says, I'm paraphrasing, he says, next time, bring with you an Ahon.
Right.
It's 12 class die, make an Ahon, an ark, and that's it. Make an ark, a Selech Ahon, that's it. Everything, Nadav, Avihu, and Betzalel, a Selech Ahon, that's it. Make a ark from wood. So yes.
And by the way, of course, the commentators don't even know if that's the same ark as we mentioned before. That's a different question.
That's right. So yes. Okay. So they took the Mishkan out of the narrative, out of the Sipur, the Agadah, and the rituals out of the law, out of the Halacha, creating a speech where the narrative does not emphasize Mikdash and the law does not emphasize ritual. What is he doing here? But this, right, from now on, it'll be interpretation. But the fact that the Mishkan is absent from the narrative and rituals are absent from the law, that is a solid
fact.
That's fact. And the only korban that is mentioned is emphasized. Shlamim. The korbanot we do with the Chagim. Shlamim. Now, I don't want to go in, this, I don't know if this is too much details for a podcast, but Olah, Korban Olah, the sacrifice of Olah, is the entire Korban is sacrificed on the Mizbeach, on the altar. Chatat, part is sacrificed, part the priests eat. Actually, when the Kohanim eat the Chatat, that's a part of the process of
It's part of the atonement, right?
Yeah, thank you. And then there is and Shlamim is eaten by the people who sacrifice it. That's Shlamim. But you have limited time. You have to eat a lot in limited time. So the way you do it, you invite other people to enjoy it. Sefer Devarim emphasizes that the other people who enjoy Korban Shlamim is the Ger, Yetom, Almana. The people who are hungry can now enjoy. That is the only Korban that is celebrated in Shlamim. Not the Korban that connects a human being to God, but the Korban that connects human beings to themselves and the stronger to the weaker. That's the only Korban that's mentioned, and that Korban is amplified and emphasized. So what is it doing here? What is it doing here? Okay. So from now on, this is no. So after reading the Book of Deuteronomy many, many times, I realized, what is this speech about? There is a basic anxiety within this speech. And it's a following anxiety. Moshe is afraid that the Hebrews will enter Eretz Yisrael, conquer Eretz Yisrael, build a monarchy in Eretz Yisrael, but then their society will deteriorate, corrupt, and they'll be exiled. And the speech is, if you follow these words, you'll be able to survive in Eretz Yisrael. But if you won't be able to survive in Eretz Yisrael. So I want to mention two things. One, it's very interesting, the gap between the mindset of the person giving the speech and the people listening to the speech. Try to imagine, Rabbi, what it means to listen to that speech in the 12th century BC. Maybe. You have anxiety because you're about to enter Eretz Yisrael and fight the Canaanites. I'm sure that's the main anxiety they have. For them, the challenge is, how do we enter Eretz Yisrael and how do we conquer Eretz Yisrael? But for Moshe, the anxiety is, how do we manage to stay in Eretz Yisrael after we conquer? Because
he's not worried about the conquering. He's worried about what happens. You're going to be fine. That's not the problem. The problem is once you actually are morally in charge.
Moshe understanding something very profound. For Jews, it's easier to build their country. It's harder to keep it going. I'm saying that while I'm right now on the verge of, I don't want to say a panic attack, but I'm filled with anxiety as an Israeli in 2023, understanding that the job of building Israel was hard, but sustaining it, keeping it going might even be harder. That is what Moshe understood. He doesn't give him one piece of advice how to conquer Israel. All his advice, all his instructions, how after you're successful, how does that success not destroy you? How do you stay in Israel? And he says, and this is what he says, if you'll keep my words, you'll be okay. So I think this is what he's doing. He's taking from all the Torah, the parts that are essential for their survival. You see, Moshe, he's not reforming the Torah. He's not saying, oh, we're canceling the rituals. No, I'm sure he thinks, and I think there's also a remisa to that. I won't go into it, but the rituals are important. Perform them. But I'm giving you now the part of the Torah. I'm not telling you all the Torah all over again. I'm just saying to you the part that keeping it and observing it is what will keep you as a society alive, glued together, and strong. Which means, I think Moshe doesn't want to change the rituals. That's a wrong interpretation. He doesn't want to cancel the rituals. It's a wrong interpretation. He just wants to emphasize the parts of the Torah that are not rituals and saying the korbanot are important. That they are not what's the part that are going to keep your society alive and going.
About a month and a half ago, I had Rabbi Joshua Berman on this podcast, and he talked about his new book about Megillat Eicha, which he says is a response to temple theology. Heichal Hashem, Heichal Hashem, Heichal Hashem Hema, that you point to the temple, that is what's going to keep us in Israel. So it sounds like you're saying that Moshe is arguing something similar to what Yirmiyahu said in Megillat Eicha. Heichal Hashem, the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, is important, it's fine, but it is not what is going to keep you in Israel. And pretending that that is the source of your strength is mistaken. That's not what will keep you in Israel. There are the other things that you got to look at that will keep you in Israel. That's the thing that you do. It's important, but it's not relevant to keeping you here. It's misguided.
And if you believe that performing all the rituals down to the detail, that will keep you in Israel, you won't stay in Israel. Because you'll forget what's really important. And you're right. So Eicha, Jeremiah, they are echoing the Moshe's theology. They are disciples of Moshe. Moshe Haban Shenevi'im, Chazal say. So Moshe, this is how it goes. Why is it the key? Why is Devarim the centerpiece of the Tanakh? Because he tells the past all over again, and the future Nevi'im are going to echo one of his important moves, creating an internal hierarchy between the mitzvot, saying that mitzvot that cultivate ethical sensitivity towards the weak. Those are the mitzvot that will keep us in Israel. And the rituals are important mitzvot, but they're not the essential part of the Torah. Practicing them, that's not what's going to keep our society alive and going in Israel.
Now, how do we make that work together with the idea of that place that Moshe keeps on emphasizing, the place where the Beit HaMikdash is? Because he may downplay korbanot, but he certainly emphasizes this concept of a central place of temple worship.
Great. So besides taking the Mishkan out of the story and the korbanot out of the law, he tells us of another law that is not, at least explicitly in the first books, and that is that we're only allowed to sacrifice sacrifices in a makom sharif chadash, in the place that got, like it, let's call it Beit HaMikdash, although that term doesn't
appear, but it's repeatedly called the place that God will choose.
A makom sharif chadash. So interesting, it's just the centralization of worship. That must mean that he thinks that the makom sharif chadash is so sacred, and therefore we can only sacrifice and worship God in that place. But there's a problem with that. How do you marry glorification of the Mikdash and de-emphasizing the rituals in the Mikdash? How do you bridge that? That's one question. And the second question is, there are also laws in the books before Sefer Devarim that apply in the Mikdash itself, like Moha Mikdash.
Having a sense of awe of the Beit HaMikdash.
Exactly. Now it appears twice, Moha Mikdash, and Rambam develops a lot of halachot of how do you develop a sense of awe of the Mikdash, and that also doesn't exist in Sefer Devarim. Moha Mikdash, the command to have awe towards the Mikdash, is not in the Sefer Devarim that centralizes everything in the Mikdash. So how do you? Okay, so
it seems paradoxical or contradictory.
Yeah, contradictory. So the korbanot aren't important, but the Mikdash is important, but Moha Mikdash doesn't exist. Okay, so how do you put this together? So I'm following here Maimonides. In Moreh Nevuchim, one of the places in the Moreh in the guide
for the Perplexed.
The Perplexed.
About which you wrote a book as well.
Which you can see
on the bookshelf behind me. So
thank you very much. So the guide Perplexed, there's three parts. So in volume 3, chapter 32, and in other places, Maimonides makes the following argument, which is very interesting. He says, why does the Torah limit the space where you could sacrifice korbanot only to one very strong place? Why does it do that? So Maimonides argues it's not because the place is holy, it's so holy, but because the Torah wants to limit the possibilities of korbanot and therefore strip korbanot from our daily life.
In other words, having a centralized place of worship isn't to emphasize the place, but to de-emphasize sacrifices elsewhere.
Yeah, so we're not allowed to have sacrifice here besides the Mikdash. The Mikdash I go 3 times a year. De facto, the centralizing worship in the Mikdash de facto creates a life of no sacrifice on a daily basis. So, and by the way, I have an analogy here. This is a little bit, provocative, but I think it's interesting. Theodor Herzl, in his great book, Medinat HaYehudim, the State of the Jews, Judenstaat, he says that we will need to build synagogues in the Jewish state. But I hope you won't be offended, Rabbi. The reason why we need synagogues in the Jewish state, so the rabbis will stay in the synagogues and they stay out of the public space. Herzl says we will somehow separate Judaism from politics, not by not building synagogues, but by building synagogues, and they'll stay there. By the way, and that's how, by building synagogues, Israel won't be a theocracy, says Herzl. By the way, just like generals stay out of politics and they stay in their bases. We have bases so that generals won't be involved in politics, and synagogues so rabbis won't be involved in politics. I think in Israel we didn't read those pages.
Yeah, I think we might have skipped those pages in his book. I mean, the truth is, it's not denigrating generals or rabbis. In fact, it's saying there is a place for them, but
exactly.
To mix together is a type of kilayim, it's a type of forbidden mixture. They have to be where they belong.
But like putting it in one place, it's also not putting it in other places. And that's what Moshe is saying. He's saying, let's put all rituals in one place and de facto emptying it from any other place. But he doesn't want the other places that don't have korbanot now empty from a connection with God. Not at all. He just doesn't want it to be that connection with God. For the Ne'um HaCharon Shel Moshe, for Sefer Devarim, he wants all the places to be filled with worshiping God. But how do you worship God according to Sefer Devarim? With words. V'ayu hadvarim ha'ele, hadvarim, the words. This is Sefer Devarim. Asher Elohim etzotcha hayor al levavecha v'shinata levanecha. The idea of repetition of God's words, which you do all day and everywhere. This is a leitmotif in Sefer Devarim. That, so I would say, that replaces sacrifice. So it says sacrifice nowhere. I mean, shrinking into one place, emptying the public sphere from sacrifice, and filling it with words, with text, with language. That is the shift of Sefer Devarim, I think.
So you're saying that Sefer Devarim, it's not just that it's de-emphasizing ritual, therefore de-emphasizing religion. Not at all. You're saying it actually has a very strong understanding of religion and God, but it changes the focus to a verbal worship of God, along with taking care of those who are in our community.
Yes. Stripping the public space from sacrifice does not mean secularization of public space. Not at all. Not at all. I think what Sefer Devarim demands is the love of God. Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elohecha. This is Sefer Devarim. B'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol modecha. It wants a connection with God that is not necessarily dependent on priest and sacrifice. It's about the picho levavcha la'asoto. It's not the big question. Who will go to the sky and bring us God's words? Who will go? No, you're not dependent on any who. You're not independent on anyone. It's you're only dependent.
Okay, then I have another question, because you talk about this too. In that one place, which is the place where God is resident, you say he's not resident. That Moshe de-emphasizes the temple as a place where Hashem is actually, quote unquote, living, which obviously is also something we say from Melachim. Shlomo HaMelech said when he argued, how can I build a house for God? The whole universe can't contain God. So what, in your understanding, is Moshe trying to do with that? Does he see God as wholly transcendent? Does he see God as immanent? What is the role of God in Moshe's understanding here?
This is very interesting. He says you can only worship God through sacrifice in the Mikdash. And then he says, by the way, God is not in the Mikdash. He says two things. Korbanot rak b'Mikdash, only the Mikdash, and God is not in the Mikdash. Now, how does it say it's not in the Mikdash? Let's give you an example of this very paradox. Like Mikra Bikurim. Feel free to say how we say this in English. Sure.
Mikra Bikurim is the text, the recitation of a text that goes along with the giving of the first fruits in the temple.
Exactly. So you bring in your first fruits and you go to God's place. And then while you offer the fruits to God, you say the following text. You say to God, Hashkifa mime'on kodechecha, I would say, observe us from where you are, mi'me'on kodechecha, from where you dwell, I guess. Mina shamayim. So I go to God's place, and the text I say, oh, this is not God's place is in the sky. So it's created contrast between the ritual and the words. The ritual, I'm going to a place. The words, by the way, this is not his place. He's in the sky. Oh, by the way, so you think he's physically in the sky? By Yayim Shamoah, we say that if we don't observe God's words, what will he do to the sky? He will la'atzor et hashamayim. And he's saying, what is that?
He'll close it up. He'll close it up.
He'll close the sky. So I guess he's not in the sky. He has control over the sky. So obviously, sky is a metaphor. He controls the sky. So according to Sefer, it is all Sefer Devarim. So when we say he's in the sky, we don't mean literally in the sky. So what do we mean? I think the Book of Deuteronomy has not a systematic theology, but an intuitive theology that God is in some way transcendent. He's not in the Mishkan. He's in the sky, but the sky is obviously a metaphor if we see the way he uses Shamayim throughout the Book of Deuteronomy. So yeah, he has an idea of a transcendent God. So, I mean, you would expect the text that centralizes ritual in the Mikdash has a theology that God is in the Mikdash. But that's not how the Deuteronomy works. The text that pushes all rituals into the Mikdash also takes God out of the Mikdash. According to Sefer Shmot, I think you could maybe say, Vasuli Mishkan V'shachanti B'tocham, and in other places, B'tocham means like somehow God is represented in a cloud in that space. According to Chazal, it's asarat farchim above the aron and the kaporet and beneath the kruvim. You might have like that. Like that's how Nachmanides Pshat understands understand that God is present there. The Book of Devarim takes God out of the Mikdash. He's in the Shamayim, and Shamayim metaphorically. So he pushes ritual into the Mikdash and God out of the.
Interesting. Although it does also say that he is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. So it's not completely making him transcendent. It also acknowledges a divine immanence too, perhaps a term that transcends both of these terms. It's saying that God is neither transcendent nor immanent. He's something else. I don't know.
What's important, but it doesn't have a systematic theology, but God is not in the Mikdash. That's not where he lives.
Right. Interesting. Now, there's so much I want to ask you. I know we don't have that much time, but I want to definitely discuss monarchy, because one of the major innovations we see in Devarim is the concept of monarchy. There was no mention of a king beforehand. And even though when it's mentioned in Parshat Shoftim, it only mentions it in the context of these are the things that the king cannot do or has to do, there's no mention of monarchical power. There's no concept of even what a king's role is, except that he can't have a lot of money, he can't have a lot of horses, he can't have a lot of wives, and he must have a Sefer Torah by him at all times. Other than that, we know nothing. So how does Sefer Devarim present a king, and what is his role?
Again, just like in the Mikdash, we have this tension where it says all worship is in the Mikdash, and yet God is not in the Mikdash. So we have something very similar when it comes to monarchy. The only text in the Torah that establishes a monarchy is Sefer Devarim. In Sefer Shemot and Bamidbar, there's no king. And there's no king, by the way, where we expect to find a king. Like, for example, in Sefer Vayikra, where it describes the different roles of, let's say, Asher Kohen Yechita. When a priest sins, what's the Korban Chatat he has to perform? Nasi Asher Yechita, like when a leader of a tribe sins, what's the Korban he has to lakriv? The missing pasuk is Melech Asher Yechita. What's the Korban of a Melech that sins? So there's two options here. The fact that pasuk doesn't exist. Option number one, the Torah thinks that kings can't sin. I doubt it.
Unlikely.
It's unlikely that the Torah that really understands human nature okay. So I think at least we don't recognize monarchy. Or for example, that pasuk, Elohim lo tekaneh v'nasi b'amcha lo ta'or. You're not allowed to curse a judge or a leader of a tribe. What about a king? Are we allowed to curse him? Two options. Either we're allowed to curse a king or just ignores monarchy. What I'm saying is that the fact that monarchy doesn't exist in other pakim in the Torah, it doesn't exist even places where it's supposed to appear. So it's like the Torah is very, as opposed to Nevi'im Rishonim, where the kings are very dominant. In the Torah, the king is shockingly not there. And the only place that the king appears, if you don't count, right. So Adomim are the kings, and then Derech Hakab, they say the Jews, the Israelites will have a king. That's in Parashat Vayishlach and Bereshit. But besides, very minor, maybe the word king was said, or also in Kitavo, but there is a king. But the only time we have
Vayechi Yaakov in the bracha, he says Ad Kiyavo Shiloh, implying it might be some sort of king figure, but very oblique. These are not obvious references.
So so you say Sefer Devarim is a book that's pro monarchy. It's the only book that mentions the king, but the book that enables us, that creates the halachic framework for a monarchy, is also the book that limits the monarchy. Just like with the Mikdash, right? It's also that limits the monarchy. How does it limit it? Like you've mentioned, Lo Yarberu Nashim. Lo Yarberu Nashim actually means limited diplomacy, because the way they created the diplomatic ties in the ancient world was that the king married the daughter of the other king. They had this concept that the way you create international relationship is turning international relationships to internal family relationships. They thought that doing family politics is easier than international politics. They were obviously not Jews if they thought that family politics are easier to manage.
This continued even into the last century in Europe. Different countries would marry. You see all the different princes and princesses. The Princess of Italy married the Prince of Belgium. It's things like that all the time.
Right now it's unthinkable, but then that's how you did it. So when Torah says that the king can't have many wives, it actually means it's limiting the State Department. It's limiting your diplomacy. Saying Lo Yarberu Susim, that's obvious. It's limiting your military. And the Kesed Zav is limiting taxation. So it actually has a vision of small government. It has a small, limited government. And the king himself, the most important part of those pasukim, by the way, is the pasuk that's not there. Because these psukim appear as a part of a larger. This is a chapter where all the institutions are found. Let's say Navi. So it says if you see a Navi and it's a Navi Emet, you have to listen to him. Or the Beit Din. We have to Lo Yasur Menu Yamin V'Shmol. We have to listen to the Beit Din. Then we have a monarchy, and it doesn't say you have to listen to the king. So this is so interesting, Rabbi, that we're not commanded to obey the king. Now that's so weird, because the oldest trick in the book is, like Spinoza argues, that religion was invented in order to create political stability. The oldest trick of the book goes like this. God told me to tell you to obey me. You use people's religious passion to create political obedience. That's the oldest trick in the book, not in our book, Rabbi. In our book, in Sefer Devarim, that trick is not used. There's not a mitzvah to obey the king. There's something else upside down. The king is ordered to obey the Torah. So we don't have a king. The king that is portrayed in Sefer Devarim is not a king that controls us. It's a king that's controlled by the law. So this is, and by the way, the first concept ever of a limited political body is in Sefer Devarim. The founding fathers of the United States of America, which quoted John Locke and quoted Montesquieu, quoted Sefer Devarim more than any other book, because the idea of limited government, an idea, by the way, us Israelis are struggling with as we're talking. How limited should government be? That idea its origins are right here in Sefer Devarim. And by the way, this also takes us back to your first question. Why did Moshe take himself out of the story? Because he has a political vision where the kings don't have a dominant role in the story of the people. So he takes himself out of the past to create a political structure that in the future, kings won't be so dominant.
That's very interesting, because in Sefer Shoftim, the Book of Judges, which takes place not long after the days of Moses, we see that there was a tribal federation and no king, and the book is explicit that having no king was not always particularly healthy. Some terrible moral wrongs took place because there was no centralized monarchy. And that fact seems to dominate much of the book and some of the very tragic episodes that took place in the book.
Oh, yeah. If we want to look if we want to now look at this whole story from 70,000 feet. So we have two political experiments in Nevi'im Rishon, Shoftim and Melachim. And they both ended terribly. Shoftim ended terribly, and Melachim ended terribly, with Churban and Ganut. Why did Sefer Shoftim end terribly? Because en Melech B'Yisrael, no centralized power. Why did Melachim end terribly? I want to argue because there was a Melech B'Yisrael. Almost all the reasons why we failed were because of kings and because of centralized power. And Bichlal, the monarchy split into two was because they wanted to have every side wanted to have too much power. So it goes like this. I think we have two political experiments in Nevi'im Rishonim. One with no king, two with kings they're over-controlling and over-dominance. Both experiments violate Sefer Devarim. Sefer Devarim is not about anarchy, and it's not about absolute monarchy. It's trying to create a limited government. And so I would say in Shoftim, they didn't obey Sefer Devarim because they didn't have a king. In Sefer Melachim, many times they didn't obey Sefer Devarim because they had a king with no boundaries and no limitations on power. So Sefer Devarim was waiting, I think the big challenge of Israel today is another experiment. It's a fourth experiment. We have the Chashmonai. And can we have centralized power, but not being too dominant, not too authoritative, and with limitations? The questions that Israelis are dealing in 2023 are biblical questions.
We have to talk about that in just a moment. But before we get there, I just want to ask you about this idea of centralized monarchy that's too powerful, because you suggest in the book that really began with Shlomo HaMelech, and you contrast Shlomo, as I mentioned, to Yehoshua. You say Yehoshua was a faithful disciple of Moshe Rabbeinu as he presents the Torah in Devarim. And you say that Shlomo HaMelech actually violated a lot of what Moshe was trying to establish, even though we see at certain points Shlomo was trying to do what Moshe wanted. For example, what I mentioned before, when he says, this house can't really contain God. Clearly, his understanding of theology was at least in part in line with what we saw in Sefer Devarim, but the centralized power aspect was violated completely. Can you talk about that for a minute?
I just want to notice, I think I'll talk about it, but with what I know in 2023 and not what I wrote in 2013.
Okay.
We see what's the real threat to Israel today? Division. Division into tribes, into groups that can't understand each other, can't argue with each other, and are starting to fight with each other and hurt each other. And what many times you can't see when you're in a fight is that by fighting with the other tribe, you're really injuring and crippling yourself. Now, that is a biblical phenomenon. That biblical phenomenon begins right after Shlomo dies. Right after Shlomo dies, the kingdom is split into two. And you ask, why was it split into two? So Sefer Melachim answers, I know we don't have a lot of time, but the northern kingdom that tries to rebel and liberate itself from the control of the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom, they go to the son of Shlomo, to Rechavam, and he says, your father over-controlled us. Please let go of it. Your father. So it's very interesting. The rebellion against Rechavam is actually a late rebellion against Shlomo. It's aggression built up all throughout the time of Shlomo. And it turns out that all the tremendous projects, building projects of Shlomo had a price, and the price was the liberty of many people, probably especially in the north. So, and all the frustration against Shlomo, they have the guts to project their frustration towards Shlomo. So when Shlomo dies, all the frustration bursts out on his poor son, and they rebel against him, and the kingdom is divided into two, and it fights each other. As 4 cycles of civil war, by the way, between Yisrael and Yehuda, until Yisrael is very weak and it's destroyed and exiled. Yehuda stayed by itself, and then it's very weak, isolated, destroyed, and exiled. That story, the deterioration of the Bible, begins after Shlomo because of some of the practices of Shlomo himself. So yes, I think Shlomo is a great example of, if the problem in Shoftim was no power, the problem of Shlomo is too much power, and they both violate the balance of Moshe, of Sefer Devarim.
Okay, let me ask a final question. And let me point out, Micah, that I have a list here of questions, and we're not going to get to so many of them because there's so much more I want to talk to you about. I hope you'll do me the honor of coming back someday to continue this conversation. But in the meantime, let's conclude with a question about, and we don't have to speak about anyone in particular or any particular philosophy, but I'd like to know, what message does Sefer Devarim have, lamaase, practically nowadays, that you think that we in the state of Israel need to take home with us? Because you mentioned before that what really worries you today, what keeps you up at night, is the fact that we're not learning the lessons of Devarim, and that building a state is easy compared to maintaining a state. What do we have to look at Sefer Devarim and learn in order to maintain the state of Israel today, given what's going on?
The importance of not getting what you want.
What do you mean?
I would say there's 2 dangerous political fantasies. One, and this was, let's say, communists used to have this sin of hubris, that if I have a grand theory and I implement that theory on the world will be shaped by my theory, and the results will be results that I could predict. And I think that idea that I could control the future is a very dangerous idea. It's idolatry. Not only communists have this idea. I think Arik Sharon in 1982 tried to reshape the Middle East, building a Maronite Christian state in Lebanon. The Palestinians will flee to Jordan. The Palestinian state there will have a new Middle East. And that backfired. Donald Rumsfeld came to the Middle East. Let's have a democratic Iraq, and the entire Middle East will imitate Iraq. The whole Middle East will be democracy. That backfired. Shimon Peres had a vision of a new Middle East. Oslo will lead the peace which will turn the entire Middle East into... That backfired. Israeli history teaches us something interesting, that we can be architects of space, but we can't be architects of time. I can build a bridge. I can control space in a predictable way, but I can't control the future. I can't control history. I can't control time. Time is not in my control. I think right now in Israel, we're suffering also because of political hubris of political leaders that never learned the law of unintended consequences, that thought that you can do radical moves and predict the results. And that is something that that is something that I think Moshe is very, very, it's just not to have political hubris. That's one. And that's what I'm saying. And F2, being willing not to get what you want, also, if it means surrendering to your enemies will lead to weakness, but surrendering to other tribes of your own country and your own society could bring strength. And being willing not to get what you want, if it means compromising with other tribes of Israel, that is also, so I would say, recognizing how limited we are intellectually, we can't predict the future. And how limited we are politically, we can't impose our will on other tribes and other groups, other people. That's a double limitation. We can't control time, and we can't over-control other Israelis, other tribes. And understanding the double limitation is something that many Israelis in all parts of Israel today, on both sides, are losing. They think they could do radical actions. I'm talking about part of the protesters and some parts of this government. Think that they could predict the results of their actions. We're recording this, by the way, Erev Shabbat, a week before Israel is going to unknown territory, and we might face unintended consequences generated by people that thought they could predict the results of their actions. Now that is everything Moshe is warning against. Moshe sees the idea that if human beings believe that they can predict the result of their own actions and they can control all the people according to their agenda and their will, meaning unlimited politics, unlimited, and no limits on your intellect. He sees that as idolatry. And I think he sees that as Egyptian idolatry. Glorification of what you could achieve in politics, that is avodah zarah. And maybe this is a good way to end. I think Moshe is the leader to try to take Israel out of Egypt, but also Egypt out of Israel. And taking Egypt out of politics means having an idea of modest politics, the politics of compromise, all this very not charismatic way of thinking about politics. And by the way, he himself didn't only take himself out of the story, he also tried to take himself out of not only out of time, but out of space. He's not out of story, out of space. The Egyptian kings were buried in pyramids. Where was Moshe buried?
Unknown.
We don't know. And the important thing, Rabbi, is that it says being forash in Sefer Devarim that we don't know where. Because if we didn't have that pasuk, we would have had at least one or two sites of the kever of Moshe Rabbeinu. And it would have been good business and everything.
Sure.
Sure. So, and then I was trying to say, the way he died is actually an anti-Egyptian death, which represents his entire life. I think there's a song, Walk Like an Egyptian.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So I think Moshe says,
the Bengals.
Live not like an Egyptian. And taking Egypt out of Israel, taking Egypt out of our politics is one of the biggest challenges that I'm very optimistic about the future of Israel, but I'm very worried about the present of Israel. And these are exactly the challenges and the questions we're wrestling with.
Okay, well, I thank you. This has been a very enlightening conversation. I learned a lot from the book, and I learned a lot from this conversation as well, and it's an honor to speak with you, and I thank you very, very much, Dr. Micah Goodman. I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Subscribe to The Orthodox Conundrum on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of The Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review The Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.